The scar ran from Sarah Bennett's left temple to her jawline, a jagged silver reminder that some wounds never fully heal. She touched it as the train shrieked to a stop at Timber Creek Station, a place that felt more like an outpost at the end of the world than a town. Through the grime-streaked window, she saw him, a tall man in a worn hat, scanning the platform with the hollow eyes of someone who'd bet their last dollar on a ghost. 3 months ago, she'd answered his ad. A mail-order bride. It sounded like a surrender. But for Sarah, it was the only move left on the board. She grabbed her single bag and stepped onto the platform. The Montana wind was a physical thing, a slap in the face that tasted of pine and snow. Timber Creek was a sorry sight. A few wooden buildings huddled together against the vast, empty landscape, with mountains looming like judges in the distance. The man from the photograph approached, and the picture hadn't done justice to the exhaustion etched into his face. James Holloway. Widower, rancher, father. Those were the facts. The truth, she could already feel, was something much darker. "Mr. Holloway," she said, extending a hand, instinctively tilting her scarred cheek away from him. It was a habit she couldn't break. He took her hand. His was calloused and surprisingly warm. His eyes met hers, registered the scar, and then moved on. There was no pity, no revulsion, just a flat, weary acceptance that seemed almost worse. "James, please," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Thank you for coming. I didn't have much choice." The words hung in the air, sharp and cold. "Neither did I," she replied, and saw a flicker of something in his eyes. He reached for her bag. "Emma's at the ranch. Mrs. Chen from the store is with her. I figured we should talk first." They walked to the only hotel in silence. Every window they passed seemed to have a pair of eyes behind the curtains. A mail-order bride was an event in a town this small, especially for a man like James Holloway. His letters had painted a picture of a respected man with a prosperous ranch. But the man walking beside her looked like a ghost haunting his own life. The hotel dining room was small and smelled of stale coffee. They sat at a scarred wooden table. "I should be honest," James began, not looking at her. "I never wanted to do this. Send for a bride. It felt like I was replacing Margaret." "What changed your mind?" Sarah asked, her voice steady. "Emma," he said, and his jaw tightened so hard, a muscle jumped. "She's in trouble, fighting at school, running away. She said she was going to find her mother in heaven because there was nothing for her here." The words landed like stones in Sarah's stomach. She knew what it was to want to escape. "I'm not her mother, James." "I know," he said, finally meeting her eyes. "I'm not asking you to be. I'm asking you to be a presence. Someone to show her that life isn't just this grief." He paused, looking down at his hands. "I'm asking for help. I can't do this alone anymore." Sarah remembered the lines from her own letter. "I told you I can cook, sew, and manage a house." James nodded slowly. "You did." She took a breath. "There are things I didn't tell you. I know how to set a broken bone, deliver a baby. I can identify 20 different medicinal plants and tell you what they cure." She touched her scar. "My husband was a doctor in Boston. When he died of cholera, his family blamed me. Said I wasn't good enough. The scar came from a patient's husband who thought the same thing." She lifted her chin, daring him to react. "So I left. Came west, where my past couldn't follow me, where I could be useful again." The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. She braced for the polite dismissal, for him to say this was all a mistake. Instead, he asked a question that changed everything. "Can you ride a horse?" Sarah blinked. "What?" "The ranch is 12 miles out," he said, his voice suddenly practical. "When the snows come, we can be cut off for weeks. If you can't ride, you'll be a prisoner out there." "I can ride," she said. "Good," he said, standing and tossing coins on the table. Then let's go home. But as they left the hotel, a man stepped out of the general store across the street. He was tall and well-dressed, but his face was a mask of cold fury. He stared at James, then his eyes flicked to Sarah, and his lip curled into a sneer. He didn't say a word, but the hatred radiating from him was so intense, Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. James grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly tight, and steered her toward his wagon. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice low. James didn't look back. "That," he said, his voice tight with a strange mix of anger and fear, "is Elias Thorne, Margaret's brother." He helped her into the wagon, his movements stiff and hurried. "He doesn't believe my wife died of pneumonia." The Holloway Ranch was a sprawling, beautiful lie. From a distance, the log house looked sturdy and prosperous, smoke curling from its chimney like a welcome. But up close, Sarah could see the neglect. A shutter hung by a single hinge. The porch steps sagged. It was a place where grief had settled in and started to rot the wood. As their wagon pulled up, the front door flew open, and a girl with wild dark hair and her father's haunted eyes stormed out. Emma Holloway. She wore boys' trousers and a scowl that could curdle milk. "This is Miss Bennett," James said, his voice strained. Emma looked Sarah up and down, her gaze lingering on the scar. "You're prettier than I thought," she said, her tone making it an insult. "Papa said mail-order brides are usually old and ugly." "Emma," James warned. "It's all right," Sarah said, stepping down from the wagon. She met the girl's defiant stare head-on. "I am desperate, and your father was honest. I appreciated that." Emma's eyes narrowed. "What happened to your face?" Before James could interrupt, Sarah answered calmly. "A man hit me with a fireplace poker. I was trying to save his wife. She died anyway. He blamed me." She tilted her head slightly. "Does it scare you?" Something flickered in the girl's hostile expression, a sliver of something that wasn't anger. "No," Emma said after a moment. "It makes you look tough." "Good," Sarah replied, "because I am." A tiny, sharp-eyed woman, Mrs. Chen, appeared in the doorway, her face a portrait of relief. After a hurried exchange, James helped her into her own wagon, and then the three of them were left in an awkward silence in the yard. "I'll show you your room," Emma said abruptly. "It's next to mine." The room was clean, but stark. A narrow bed, a dresser, a washstand. But on the dresser was a small jar of wildflowers, already starting to wilt. "I picked those," Emma mumbled from the doorway. "Papa said it was polite." "They're lovely," Sarah said, touching a petal. Emma shifted. "Do you really know how to set bones?" "Yes." "Could you teach me?" The question was a challenge. "Why do you want to learn?" Sarah asked, turning to face her. "Because Papa says doctors are scarce, and I'm not good at girl things, but maybe I could be good at this." In that moment, Sarah saw past the anger to the scared little girl underneath, a girl trying to find her own way to be tough. "Then I'll teach you," Sarah said, "but first you have to show me everything, every corner of this ranch." Emma's face broke into a grin that transformed her. "Yes, ma'am," she said. That night, after a tense dinner where every scrape of a fork sounded like an accusation, Sarah lay in the narrow bed, listening to the house groan around her. She couldn't shake the image of Elias Thorne's face, or the chilling certainty in his eyes. James hadn't mentioned his brother-in-law in his letters. He hadn't mentioned the suspicion that clung to him like a shroud. He'd offered her a home, but what he'd really brought her into was a war. Sleep wouldn't come. The room felt occupied. It was Margaret's room, she realized with a jolt. James hadn't even bothered to change it. The quilt on the bed was a wedding ring pattern. A faint scent of lavender, not wildflowers, clung to the air. Restless, she got up and walked to the window. The moon was high and cold, illuminating the yard below. She saw a figure moving near the barn. It was James. He wasn't doing chores. He was digging. Frantically, with a shovel, he was digging a hole just inside the darkened doorway of the barn. Sarah's blood ran cold. What was he burying? Or, she thought with a surge of pure terror, what was he digging up? She held her breath, heart hammering against her ribs as James worked. After several minutes, he stopped, pulled a small, dark wooden box from the hole, and quickly filled the earth back in, tamping it down with his boots. He looked around, his head darting left and right like a spooked animal, before clutching the box to his chest and disappearing back into the main part of the house. Sarah backed away from the window, her mind racing. Pneumonia. That's what he'd said. A simple, tragic illness. But men who lost their wives to illness didn't bury secrets in the dead of night. They didn't have brothers-in-law who looked at them with murder in their eyes. Every instinct she had, honed by years of seeing people at their most desperate and dishonest, screamed that James Holloway was lying. And she was trapped here, miles from anywhere, with him and his troubled daughter. The next few days were a tightrope walk of forced civility. Sarah cooked and cleaned, organized the chaotic household, and began her lessons with Emma, all while watching James with a hawk's intensity. He was a man of contradictions, gentle with his daughter, fair with his ranch hands, yet possessed of a deep, simmering darkness she would glimpse when he thought no one was looking. He never mentioned the box, and Sarah never asked. She needed more information before she confronted him. She needed leverage. The opportunity came when James and his men went out to mend a fence line on the far side of the property, a full day's work. "Stay inside," he told Sarah and Emma. "Elias has been seen sniffing around the area." It was a warning, but it sounded like a threat. Once they were gone, Sarah went to work. Emma, surprisingly, was her key. "Where did your mother keep her things?" she asked the girl, as they kneaded bread dough. Emma's face clouded over. "Papa packed most of it away, in the attic." The attic was a dusty, forgotten space, filled with ghosts and shrouded furniture. In a large trunk, under a pile of yellowed linens, Sarah found what she was looking for: Margaret Holloway's personal effects, books, a few dresses, and a leather-bound journal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The first entries were filled with the mundane details of ranch life. But then the tone began to shift. October 12th. Elias visited today. He is angry about the water rights again. He says James is a fool, that he is sitting on a fortune and doesn't even know it. I don't like the way he looks at our valley, like a wolf looks at a lamb. A week later, another entry. James is worried. Cattle are sick again, the ones that drink from the creek downstream. He thinks it's a natural blight, but I'm not so sure. Old Man Hemlock's herd was hit last year just before he sold his land to Elias for a pittance. Now Elias owns everything east of us. Sarah's breath hitched. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning faster and faster. The entries grew more frantic. Margaret wrote about a strange metallic taste in the water, about headaches and fatigue that wouldn't go away. She'd secretly sent a water sample to a friend, a chemist in Helena. November 5th. James thinks I'm imagining things. He is so tired, so worn down. He won't listen. He won't see what Elias is doing. The letter came from Helena. It is worse than I imagined. The water, it's not just blighted, it's poisoned. Arsenic, slow, steady. Elias is poisoning our land to force us out. The final entry was a scrawl, the handwriting barely legible. November 19th. I confronted James with the letter. He didn't believe me. He called me hysterical, said I was trying to drive a wedge between him and my own brother. We had a terrible fight. Now I feel so ill. The tea Mrs. Chen brought over. It tasted so bitter. James is watching me. He looks afraid. Sarah slammed the diary shut, her heart pounding a sick rhythm against her ribs. Pneumonia. It was a lie. A carefully constructed lie. Margaret hadn't died of an illness. She'd been poisoned. And her own husband had dismissed her fears, fought with her, and then stood by while she died. The bitter tea, from Mrs. Chen, the kindly shopkeeper. Was she in on it? Was the whole town complicit? She heard a noise downstairs and froze. A floorboard creaked. Someone was in the house. It was too early for James to be back. With the heavy diary clutched in her hand, Sarah crept to the attic door and peered through the crack. It wasn't James. It was Elias Thorne. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen, his cold eyes scanning the room as if he owned it, and in his hand he held a rifle. Sarah's mind raced. Emma. Where was Emma? She had sent the girl out to the root cellar to fetch potatoes not 10 minutes ago. Elias was between her and the cellar door. He took a step toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms, his movements slow and deliberate. He was hunting. Sarah backed away from the door, her heart a cold lump of ice in her chest. She scanned the attic, desperate for a weapon, for an escape. Her eyes landed on a pile of old ropes and pulleys. An idea, desperate and insane, sparked in her mind. It was a terrible risk, but staying here was a death sentence. She had to create a diversion. Something to draw him away from the root cellar, to give Emma a chance. She found a small, heavy wooden chest and carefully, silently, dragged it to the far side of the attic, directly above the front parlor. Taking a deep breath, she shoved it over. It hit the floorboards with a deafening crash that echoed through the silent house. Downstairs, Elias swore, startled. "Who's there?" he yelled, his voice sharp. Sarah didn't wait. She scrambled back toward the attic door, her only hope that he would go to investigate the noise. She heard his heavy boots moving toward the parlor. It was now or never. She slipped out of the attic and flew down the stairs, her feet barely touching the wood. She didn't dare look back. She wrenched open the kitchen door and ran, not toward the barn, but toward the dense woods that bordered the property. "Emma!" she screamed, praying the girl would hear her, praying she would have the sense to stay hidden. "Run!" Behind her, she heard a furious shout, and then the splintering crash of the front door being kicked open. Elias had realized the trick. The chase was on. Sarah ran blindly, branches whipping at her face, her lungs burning. The diary was still clutched in her hand, a heavy, damning piece of evidence. She could hear him behind her, crashing through the undergrowth, gaining on her. He was a man of the country. She was a city woman. She didn't stand a chance in a race. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw him, not 50 yards back, raising his rifle. There was nowhere to hide. Just as he leveled the barrel, a blur of motion erupted from the side. A huge, dark shape slammed into Elias, sending him sprawling to the ground with a cry of pain and surprise. It was Duke, James's border collie, snarling and snapping with a ferocity Sarah had never seen. The dog had bought her a few precious seconds. She didn't waste them. She scrambled up a rocky embankment, her fingers raw, and threw herself into a thicket of thorns, pulling the diary in with her. Below, she could hear the savage sounds of the fight. Duke's furious barking, Elias's curses, the sickening thud of the rifle butt hitting flesh. Then, a single sharp yelp of pain from the dog, followed by silence. A terrible, heavy silence. Sarah lay frozen, tears streaming down her face, convinced he would find her. She waited for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she heard him muttering, cursing his luck, and then the sound of his footsteps retreating back toward the house. He was giving up. For now. Trembling, she waited until she was sure he was gone before crawling out of her hiding place. Duke lay on the forest floor, his side a bloody mess, but he was breathing, whimpering, but alive. He had saved her. As she knelt beside the dog, her medical instincts taking over, her eyes fell on something near where Elias had fallen. It was a small leather pouch, its drawstring broken in the struggle. Inside was a fine white powder. Sarah's blood ran cold. She recognized it instantly. Arsenic. She patched up Duke as best she could, using strips torn from her petticoat, and helped the whimpering dog limp back toward the house. The ranch was silent, unnervingly so. She found Emma huddled in the back of the root cellar, pale but unharmed. The girl threw her arms around Sarah, sobbing with relief. "I heard you scream," Emma cried. "I was so scared." "I know," Sarah whispered, holding her tight, "but we're safe now." But she knew it was a lie. Elias would be back, and now he knew that she knew. When James returned at dusk, he found a scene of chaos. Sarah was in the kitchen, her dress torn and blood-stained, calmly stitching up Duke's side on the table. Emma was sitting nearby, her face streaked with tears, clutching Sarah's hand. James took one look at the scene, his face turning ashen. "What happened?" he breathed. "Your brother-in-law paid us a visit," Sarah said, her voice dangerously calm. She didn't look up from her work. "He was looking for something, or someone. He had a rifle, James. And this." She pushed the leather pouch across the table. James stared at the white powder, then at Sarah, a dawning horror in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but she cut him off. "I also found this," she said, placing Margaret's diary on the table next to the arsenic. "You should read it, especially the last entry." James sank into a chair, his face a mask of disbelief and guilt. He read the pages, his hands shaking. He saw his late wife's fears, her suspicions, her desperate pleas for him to believe her. He saw his own dismissal, his own angry words thrown back at him from the page. He saw the truth he had refused to see. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with a terrible, soul-crushing anguish. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I swear to God, Sarah, I didn't know. I thought the grief was making her imagine things. We fought. The night before she got sick, we had the worst fight of our lives. I left. I rode out and stayed the night in the line cabin. When I came back the next morning, she was already sick, burning with fever." "The tea from Mrs. Chen," Sarah stated, her voice flat. James nodded, his face haggard. "Yes, Mrs. Chen was here when I got back. She said Margaret had caught a terrible chill. She was brewing her special herbal tea. She said it would help." His voice broke. I let her give my wife poison." He looked at the diary, at the pouch of arsenic. "Elias, it was him all along. He wanted the ranch. Margaret knew it. She tried to warn me." "Why did you lie about her death, James?" Sarah asked, her voice softening slightly at his obvious agony. "Why tell everyone it was pneumonia?" He finally met her gaze, and she saw the shame burning there. "Pride," he said, the word barely a whisper. "And fear. The doctor from town, he was suspicious. He said the symptoms weren't quite right for pneumonia. He asked questions. Elias was there, playing the grieving brother. He started dropping hints that Margaret had been unstable, that she might have taken her own life." James buried his face in his hands. "I couldn't bear it. The shame of it. So I paid the doctor to sign the certificate. Pneumonia. It was cleaner. It was a lie I could live with. I buried the truth, Sarah. I buried her letter from the chemist, the one she fought with me about. I put it in a box and buried it in the barn, hoping it would just go away." So that was the secret in the box. Not a confession, but evidence he'd hidden out of shame. Before Sarah could process this, a thought struck her, cold and sharp. Mrs. Chen. Why would she help him? She seems to adore Emma. "She's his aunt," James said, his voice hollow. "Margaret's aunt, too. She raised them both after their parents died. She always favored Elias, always said he was the smart one, the ambitious one." A kindly old woman brewing poison for her own niece. The betrayal was staggering, and she was still out there, still in town. Emma, who had been listening silently, suddenly spoke up, her voice small. "The pies," she said. "Mrs. Chen brings us a pie every week. She says it's for me, but Papa always eats a piece too." Sarah and James stared at each other, a new, horrifying understanding dawning between them. It hadn't stopped with Margaret. Elias wasn't just trying to scare them off the land. He was trying to finish the job, slowly, patiently, with his aunt's help. The entire Holloway family was being systematically exterminated, one bitter-tasting pie at a time. The knowledge settled in the room, thick and suffocating. They weren't just fighting for a piece of land anymore. They were fighting for their lives. "We have to go to the sheriff," Sarah said, her voice firm, breaking the spell of horror. James shook his head, a look of utter despair on his face. "Sheriff Brody? He and Elias are thick as thieves. They hunt together, play cards together. Brody owes Elias money. He'll never believe us. Not my word against Elias Thorne's. Not without irrefutable proof." "Then we'll get it," Sarah declared, a cold resolve hardening within her. Her past had been about healing, but now her knowledge of medicine, of plants, of poisons, would become her weapon. "Margaret sent a water sample to a chemist in Helena. We have his name from her diary. He's our proof. We also have what's left of the arsenic. And we have the pie in the pantry." She stood up, her exhaustion replaced by a surge of adrenaline. "Elias wants this ranch because his silver mine is poisoning the water. He can't have anyone knowing that. Margaret found out, so he killed her. Now we know, and he'll kill us. Our only chance is to expose him for what he is, not just to the law, but to the whole town." "How?" James asked, looking at her as if she were a stranger. "Elias owns half of Timber Creek. People are afraid of him." "People are also greedy," Sarah countered. "What do you think will happen when they find out he's been sitting on a silver mine while the rest of them struggle? What happens when they find out he poisoned the water they all use? He's not just a threat to you, he's a threat to everyone." She looked from James's haunted face to Emma's terrified one. "He thinks I'm a helpless mail-order bride. He thinks you're a broken-down widower. He thinks Emma is just a child. He's wrong, and we're going to prove it." Their plan was desperate, forged in the flickering lamplight of the kitchen. They had two advantages. Elias didn't know about the diary, and he thought Sarah was just a victim, not a threat. They would use that. The first step was to get a message to the chemist in Helena, a man named Mr. Abernathy. One of the ranch hands, a young, loyal man named Buck, was dispatched at dawn with a carefully worded letter and a sample from the pie, riding hard for the nearest train station 50 miles away. It would take him at least 4 days to get there and back if he made it at all. 4 days where they were on their own. During that time, they had to play a dangerous game. They had to act normal. James, on the other hand, Tom, went about their daily chores, their rifles never far from reach. Sarah and Emma stayed close to the house. Sarah spent hours with Margaret's diary and her own medical knowledge, piecing together the full picture. The symptoms Margaret described weren't just arsenic poisoning. There was something else, a secondary element that accelerated the process. She found it in Margaret's notes on local flora, a plant called death camas. When mixed with arsenic, its toxic alkaloids would create a fast-acting poison that mimicked the rapid onset of a respiratory illness. Like pneumonia, it was clever, diabolical, and it was a level of botanical knowledge that pointed not to Elias, but to someone who worked with herbs and remedies. Mrs. Chen. The third day, Mrs. Chen herself drove up in her buggy, a fresh pie steaming on the seat beside her. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. "Just checking on you, dears," she chirped, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "I heard that brother of mine was causing trouble again." She bustled into the kitchen, placing the pie on the table. It smelled of apples and cinnamon, and death. "He frightened the life out of us," Sarah said, forcing her voice to tremble. "Thank you for this, Mrs. Chen. We haven't had much of an appetite." "Nonsense, child," the old woman said, patting her arm. "You need to keep your strength up. A little treat will do you all good." Her eyes, small and sharp, darted around the room, missing nothing. She was checking on her handiwork, Sarah realized, seeing if the poison was taking effect. Emma, coached by Sarah, played her part perfectly, staying silent and wide-eyed, clutching Sarah's skirt. James entered from the back, his face grim. "Agnes," he said, his voice strained. "Good of you to stop by." "Just looking after my family, James," she said sweetly. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. As she was leaving, she paused at the door. "You know, Margaret was so fond of my herbal teas, especially toward the end. Said they were the only thing that eased her breathing." It was a veiled threat, a reminder of her power. When she was gone, James took the pie with a set of tongs and dropped it into the fire, where it sizzled and burned with a sick-smelling smoke. "How long can we keep this up?" he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "She knows something is wrong. She could feel it." "Until Buck gets back," Sarah said, her voice tight. "We just have to hold on." But their timeline was about to be violently accelerated. That night, a storm rolled in, a furious black monster that threw rain and wind against the house. In the middle of it, Tom, the older ranch hand, stumbled into the kitchen, soaking wet and bleeding from a gash on his head. "It's Elias," he gasped, collapsing into a chair. "He and a couple of his men. They ambushed me out by the northern pasture. They have Buck. They grabbed him on his way back from the station." The world seemed to stop. They had Buck, which meant they had the letter from the chemist. They knew. "They're coming here," James said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. "They're coming to finish this tonight." He grabbed his rifle from the wall. "Sarah, take Emma. Barricade yourselves in the cellar. Don't come out, no matter what you hear." "No," Sarah said, standing her ground. "We're not hiding. We're not running. This is our home. We fight for it. Together." She looked at the terror in Emma's eyes and saw it replaced by a flicker of the same fierce resolve. She turned to Tom. "How many men?" "Elias and 2 others that I saw," he said, wincing as Sarah pressed a cloth to his head. "They'll be here soon." "3 men against us," James said, checking his rifle's chamber. "The odds aren't good." "Then we'll change the odds," Sarah replied, her mind already working, cataloging the resources she had at her disposal. Not guns and bullets, but the contents of her medical bag and the chemicals in the pantry. Carbolic acid, lye, sulfur powder, things for healing and cleaning that could, in the right combination, become weapons. "James, bar the doors and windows. Tom, if you can stand, I need you to watch the back. Emma, you're with me." In the storm-lashed kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the threat of imminent violence, Sarah Bennett, the disgraced doctor's wife, the mail-order bride, prepared for war. She was no longer just trying to heal. She was trying to survive. "Emma, I need the strongest whiskey you can find," Sarah commanded, her voice a beacon of calm in the rising storm of fear, "and all the empty bottles." While James and Tom secured the house, Sarah and Emma worked with a frantic, focused energy. They shredded cloth for wicks and filled bottles with a volatile mixture of whiskey and lamp oil, makeshift fire bombs. Sarah then took a small pouch of sulfur powder, used for treating cattle hides, and mixed it with a jar of powdered sugar from the pantry. She poured the mixture into a heavy iron skillet. "When I tell you," she said, looking Emma straight in the eye, "you are to throw this into the stove. Do you understand?" Emma, her face pale but her eyes steady, nodded. The sound came moments later, a heavy thud against the front door, then another. They were trying to break it down. "They're here," James breathed, taking up a position by the front window. A gunshot shattered the glass, the bullet burying itself in the wall just above his head. "Get down!" he yelled. The siege had begun. Another crash came from the back of the house, followed by Tom shouting, "They're at the kitchen door!" Elias was splitting their attention, trying to break them from 2 sides. "James, stay here!" Sarah yelled, grabbing 2 of the firebombs. Emma, come with me! They raced to the kitchen as the back door began to splinter under the force of a heavy blow. Tom, get away from the door, Sarah ordered. She lit the rag on one of the bottles, the flames sputtering to life. With a cry that was part fear and part fury, she hurled it through the kitchen window. It shattered on the back porch, engulfing the area in a whoosh of flame. Screams of pain and surprise cut through the howl of the wind. One of them was out of the fight. But the assault on the front door only intensified. A heavy log, used as a battering ram, smashed against the wood, the door frame groaning in protest. "He's going to get through," James shouted. "Sarah!" "Now, Emma!" Sarah screamed. Emma didn't hesitate. She flung the contents of the skillet into the roaring fire of the wood stove. The sulfur and sugar ignited with a deafening roar and a massive flash of brilliant white light, sending a huge cloud of thick, choking smoke billowing out into the room and up the chimney. Outside, the effect was instantaneous. The men at the front, blinded and disoriented by the sudden volcanic eruption of smoke and light from the chimney, fell back in confusion. It was the break they needed. James fired his rifle through the window, and a cry from the darkness told him he'd found his mark. Silence fell, broken only by the storm and the crackle of the fire on the back porch. "Is it over?" Emma whispered. "No," James said, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Elias isn't the kind to give up." He was right. A voice cut through the rain, dripping with venom. "You can't hide in there forever, Holloway. I have your man, Buck, and he told me everything. He told me about the chemist. There will be no rescue for you." It was a lie, Sarah knew. Buck might have been captured, but he would never betray them. Elias was trying to break their spirit. Then his voice changed, becoming almost conversational. "Come out, Sarah. I have a proposition for you. You're a smart woman, wasted on a coward like him. Join me. We can share the profits from the mine. You'll have more money than you've ever dreamed of." "Don't listen to him," James growled. "I'm not," Sarah said. But she was listening, not to the words, but to the location of his voice. He was to the left of the house, near the corner, hidden in the darkness. She had one firebomb left. It was a long shot. She crept to the shattered front window, shielded by the wall. She could just make out his silhouette against the dark shape of the barn. She lit the wick, took a deep breath, and threw it with all her might. It fell short, exploding in a puddle and casting the area in a flickering, hellish light. But it did its job. For a split second, Elias was perfectly illuminated, and in that second, James fired. A strangled cry echoed through the night, and the silhouette crumpled to the ground. For a long moment, there was no sound but the rain. Then, slowly, James opened the ruined front door. One of Elias's men lay groaning on the ground, his leg shattered. The other was gone, likely the one burned on the back porch. And near the barn, Elias Thorne lay still, a dark stain spreading across his chest. As James cautiously approached, a figure stumbled out of the darkness from the direction of the main road. It was Buck, his face bruised, but his eyes blazing with triumph. And behind him were 4 other men on horseback. "Sheriff Brody," Buck called out, "looks like you're a little late to the party." The sheriff and his posse reined in, their faces a mixture of shock and confusion at the scene of carnage before them. "What in God's name happened here?" Brody demanded. "Justice happened, Sheriff," Sarah said, stepping out onto the porch, her face smudged with soot, her eyes burning with intensity. She held up Margaret's diary. "Elias Thorne murdered his sister. He's been poisoning the Holloway family and their land for over a year. He tried to kill us all tonight to cover his tracks." She then held up the letter Buck had brought back. "And this is a sworn affidavit from a chemist in Helena, confirming the presence of arsenic and other toxins in the Holloway's well water, toxins consistent with mining runoff." Buck had done more than just deliver a message. He had returned with the law, albeit a compromised one. Faced with a living witness, a dead body, and a legal document, Sheriff Brody had no choice. His alliance with Elias Thorne was worthless now. The aftermath was a blur. The injured were tended to, Elias's body was taken away, and the story began to spread like wildfire through Timber Creek. The story of the mail-order bride who was not a victim, but a warrior. The story of the quiet rancher who fought to protect his family. And the story of Elias Thorne's secret silver mine and the poison he'd unleashed on the valley. By the time the sun rose, the Holloway Ranch was no longer a place of secrets and fear, but a symbol of survival. Mrs. Chen was arrested in town, her pantry found to be a veritable apothecary of poisons. She confessed everything, a shrunken, bitter old woman whose greed had curdled into pure evil. Weeks later, life began to find a new rhythm. The ranch was being rebuilt, the community, shocked into action, offering help. The Thorne mine was seized by the territory, its future uncertain. But for the three people at the heart of the storm, the healing was slower, deeper. One evening, Sarah, James, and Emma stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple. "He thought you were weak because you were grieving," Sarah said softly to James. "He thought I was weak because I was a woman. He thought Emma was weak because she was a child. He never understood that the things that break us are the things that can make us strong." James turned and took her hand, his thumb gently tracing the scar on her cheek. "When I saw you step off that train, I thought I was making a practical arrangement. I was wrong. I was bringing home a miracle." He looked at Emma, who was leaning against Sarah, her head on her shoulder. "We were a broken family. You made us whole." He then got down on one knee, not with the desperation of a man advertising for a wife, but with the quiet certainty of a man who had found his partner. "Sarah Bennett, I know our beginning was built on lies and fear. I want our future to be built on truth and love. Will you marry me? For real this time?" Tears streamed down Sarah's face, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Emma let out a whoop of delight and threw her arms around both of them, and for the first time, the house behind them truly felt like a home. They had faced the darkness together and won. Their scars, visible and invisible, were not reminders of what they had lost, but of what they had fought to save. They were survivors, a family forged in fire, ready to build a new life not on the ashes of the past, but on the solid ground of a future they had claimed for themselves. If you enjoyed this story of courage and survival, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new tale, and let us know in the comments what you think the most shocking twist was. Your support helps us keep bringing these incredible stories to light. Thank you for watching.